if I've got this correctly, my part in this particular steps forward um, um, uh, series on if you want on safeguarding is to talk about particularly the role of families in safeguarding. So I may mention some other things relative to safeguarding in the larger context, but I'll focus primarily with respect to families. And as just to be clear, as Arden already mentioned, the thing that I'm most passionate and interested in safeguarding is the approach to inclusive post-secondary education as myself and Dr. Ann Hewson developed over time. And so that's what I'm interested in safeguarding. I will reference the fact that there are at least four models of governance of initiatives or organizations providing inclusive post-secondary education. There may be more, probably there are, but I'm aware mostly of four. And so it's important to understand that I will be relating to those four sort of governing constructs. One is where inclusive post-secondary education, as they defined in the reflection tool developed by Inclusion Alberta, sits within a much larger family organization such as Inclusion Alberta, whereby inclusive post-secondary education is just um, one element of what Inclusion Alberta does with respect to supporting individuals and families and inclusion across the lifespan and all the dimensions of life. Another would be a governance model such as Steps Forward, which is primarily focused on providing inclusive post-secondary initiatives at campuses, in this case across the province of British Columbia. A third is where there's a nonprofit, which would mean there's typically a board made up primarily of families, but they only operate one initiative, okay, on a particular campus, and they tend to be, largely singular and isolated from a larger context. And the fourth would be those that are operated by the institutions themselves, whether it's a college, university, a technical institute, et cetera. So I'm going to try to touch on all four of those and the relationship of families to those particular models. I think everybody would likely know that the purpose of safeguarding is actually to provide protection in response to vulnerabilities. So we're going to have to talk at least about what some of those vulnerabilities would be with respect to inclusive post-secondary education. And to remember that while some points of vulnerability can be anticipated, as I'll describe momentarily, and therefore you can be working on those. There are other things that will happen that threaten or jeopardize or diminish the quality of inclusive post-secondary education that are not always predictable. And so it's important to continually work to have strong safeguard strategies in place, of which families can be one, right? In order to not simply be prepared for those points of vulnerability one can anticipate, but actually to be able to respond and rise to the occasion when other vulnerabilities emerge that may not have been anticipated. And since we're talking about vulnerabilities, there are clear differences in vulnerabilities for families. And when I use the term families, I mean it in the broadest sense possible. However, people choose to come together and call themselves a family. It's not the sort of traditional, nuclear family kind of idea. It's a family in the broadest context. So it's a word just used to describe multiple ways in which relationships work among people who care and love and look after each other. Um, so the reason for raising the point about the vulnerabilities differ for families from those of organizations is so that you can take them into account. And I'm just going to change some there. You can take them into account when you're thinking as an organization or a provider of inclusive post-secondary education How do we work with families to enable them to be in the best possible position to support the safeguarding? It's important to recognize families can be only one element of safeguarding for an organization. They are not, in my view, the ultimate safeguard, the singular safeguard, the place where we can, the location in which we can place all of our hopes for safeguarding, etc. So I think we all want to understand the way in which families fit into safeguarding, as opposed to assuming that because we have families in place in a governance of a board of directors or an advisory committee with respect to an institutionally operated inclusive post-secondary education initiative, they, by virtue of being families, can safeguard. That's simply not the fact, as I'll try to illustrate throughout the time that we're together there. It's critical then to remember the priority for families is always to safeguard their family member with it, in this case, with an intellectual disability, or if you're supporting others with different disabilities to be included in post-secondary education. That has to be their priority. Okay? Their priority is lifelong across all dimensions of life. And while there is a necessity to engage them as much as possible in safeguarding inclusive post-secondary education, that's only a small part of the totality of life of somebody that they care or love for or worry about in terms of their sustaining their current inclusion and their future inclusion and access to a good life. And in addition to the person with a disability being their priority, there are a far greater number of vulnerabilities or threats that families have to anticipate and respond to over the course of someone's lifetime. Um, and it's important to recognize that there may be times actually for the Inclusive Post-Secondary Initiative to be responding and supporting families in matters that are not related to inclusive post-secondary education, where they're experiencing a vulnerability or threat. Maybe they've lost some other form of funding or support, or some other serious situation has evolved for their family, and to support them through that so that they can come back into being a safeguard element with respect to their family members' inclusion in post-secondary education. As complicated as it might be and is, to ensure quality inclusive post-secondary education, and particularly so over time. And if you are an organization or initiative across multiple campuses, it's still not as complicated as family life or as unpredictable. And again, it's just a way of saying to those of us who are trying and working on engaging families and safeguarding to take into account at the same time what their life might look like, and what we may need to do in order to ensure they have the capacity, opportunity to participate in safeguarding, because in effect, what they learn about safeguarding and inclusive post-secondary education will position them to better safeguard the continuing inclusion of their family member subsequent to post-secondary education. So in that way, right, in one end, it's a mutually beneficial or reciprocally beneficial operation. So the family is assisting in safeguarding inclusive education. At the same time, they're learning about safeguarding. That enables them to potentially be more equipped in the long term to see their family member benefit from their experience of inclusive post-secondary education as they move through the rest of their life. So, and when you share that with families, because when you're asking for time and commitment for them to be engaged in safeguarding, understand what that is, etc., you are able to explain to them this is going to benefit you as well outside of inclusive post-secondary education. So it's to our mutual benefit to be participating in this process. And now we're not moving slides. There we go. So for families to participate and contribute, they need to know and understand an organization's likely points of vulnerability. This means, for me at least, actively, consciously engaging families in a learning process, not just assuming that they understand and are committed to the overarching values of inclusive post-secondary education, for example, um, or that they know what the most promising practices at the moment and what the future practices should look like. Families have to be actively engaged in a continuous educational process, which means a little separate from safeguarding, the initiative or organization providing inclusive post-secondary education ideally embodies the elements of a learning organization: critical thinking, reflective practice, generative problem solving, etc. When you have and are committed to a learning organization and the elements of that, you're in a better position within that context to focus on safeguarding and on safeguarding with respect to the role that families play within that. So, that's a larger construct in which this sits. That is the learning organization being the larger organization. So these are some typical vulnerabilities most organizations actually will face over the course of time. One that I've chosen to describe as values erosion. It's sort of is a means of saying, when the values actually become more lip service. So we can use, for example, the word inclusion today, which literally means anything and everything. And when you're having a conversation with somebody about what is inclusion and what isn't, you actually have to take the time today to clarify what each of you mean with respect to inclusion. Because it could mean, in fact, a totally segregated, congregated program that is actually life wasting, and it's got inclusion in its name, or it's perceived as such. So while many organizations like inclusive post-secondary education or initiatives start off with a clear articulation of values, entropy, that is sort of the deterioration of things over time, is a natural universal law. Okay? It applies to organizations as much as it applies to the physical universe. And one should anticipate that there's going to be a declining clarity in our values and their meaning, and that we need to continually revisit that to ensure we have as much clarity as possible as to what we mean with respect to the values that govern an inclusive post-secondary initiative. This is the most critical element in terms of safeguarding. Values typically don't change much over time. Programmatic practices are more likely to evolve and change. Another example of where to anticipate vulnerabilities with respect to programmatic drift. What I mean by that, I'll give you an example. Maybe early in the development of an inclusive post-secondary education initiative, there's a commitment to including students with complex, challenging intellect and associated intellectual disabilities. That can be hard to do, hard to maintain, hard to fund. And gradually, there may be drift away from that, and people stop examining to what degree are we inclusive across the spectrum of intellectual disability. Or it can be, we've opened the doors to inclusion in these courses or faculties or programs of study, and we've limited ourselves to that, and we've stopped advancing the opportunities for inclusion in a greater array of courses and programs of study. So things along those lines. Sorry, I'm trying to talk quickly so we can get to more opportunity for a little bit of dialogue. Obviously, government funding and policies, of which we have typically very little control, and so have to be prepared to be able to be innovative, to be adaptive, to work around, interfering government policies, limitations in funding, etc. And in many ways, families can be a key element in safeguarding with respect to advocacy towards government, and more so than those that are actually the people that are paid to operate the inclusive post-secondary initiative. Successions and transitions are a huge point of vulnerability for the nonprofit sector in particular. And as organizations grow, such as Steps Forward that operates on multiple campuses in multiple communities and across different types of institutions, okay, there's added complexities. And it wouldn't be unusual when you are one of those initiatives that has a voluntary board that people look for the next CEO or leader or senior staff to have managerial, qualities or experience, when what is essential is a visionary leader. This is a very prominent error that's occurring in our field today as organizations have matured over time. And the people responsible for hiring the next CEO or senior leader, for example, haven't been educated with respect to what a successful transition looks like and what the next leader should look like. And very solid, inclusive, doesn't have to be post-secondary initiatives can go off the rails actually during this transition process. The other place to look for vulnerabilities with respect to the post-secondary institutions. President changes, the program, is situated in one part of the university or college, and then it's moved to another part. People change roles, etc. Policies change, and so on. And the same might be true with respect to partners, where you have long-standing relationship with community partners such as employers, something in the organizations where you've been able to secure employment upon graduation for students, that leadership changes, and suddenly maybe the door is closed. And lastly, it's when families don't question or challenge authority. So you want questioning families, okay? You want to instill that ideal within them, right? So that they know, those of you that are leading inclusive post-secondary education are open to being questioned or challenged and being thoughtful in your responses. So I do see initiatives, small ones typically, that have nonprofit boards, and they are completely and totally under the thumb of their CEO, or senior staff person or executive director, whatever title they may have for that person. And basically, the organization of the initiative stagnates over time and can continue to do so for decades. There is nothing magical about inclusive post-secondary initiatives that safeguard or protect them from this kind of stagnation over time, where you visit an initiative 20 or 30 years later, and they're still practicing the way they did initially and haven't evolved in terms of better practices or expanding the initiatives to be more successful in the outcomes they're attempting to achieve. So to talk about values erosion first, okay? It's critical that, Arden said at the very beginning and articulated sort of the setting, some of the values, in fact, that govern inclusive post-secondary education in Western Canada. But it's not all the initiatives, by the way, within Western Canada. It's just, unfortunately, some. To enable families to be one of the safeguard elements, it's critical that those values be clearly articulated and known by literally everyone who comes into contact with the inclusive post-secondary initiative, families just being one of those. Okay. One can't rest on sort of laurels, so to speak, with respect to the fact that, or assume people have the same shared deep understanding of the governing values of the inclusive post-secondary education, particularly over time, as with respect to new families coming in over time, over the course of successive moments of graduation or completion of study. You have to take the time with new staff, with new people coming in the university itself or the post-secondary institution, and with families to ensure values clarification is part of your continual efforts, and that you see it as essential. And um, and which means providing access to training and learning opportunities for families, not just for the people that are providing or supporting inclusive post-secondary education or the faculty that are accommodating students in their classes or programs, but also for families, okay, encouraging them and suggesting where they could be learning, opportunities they might participate in, trying to provide access to those at times that work for families who may not have the time during the day to easily take off work, for example, in order to participate in a learning opportunity. Part of that, again, is that families hold the key to the longevity of inclusion post-secondary education. So you're not only, in a way, safeguarding inclusive post-secondary education by doing this, you're trying to safeguard inclusion across the lifespan as well, at least as much as you can influence it during the time you're engaged with those families. This means for those that are really committed to safeguarding, actively engaging families in measuring and examining the initiative's policies and practices. This follows from providing them with the training and learning opportunities so that they too could be involved in sort of reflective analysis or practice with respect to how their family member has been and others are being accommodated and included in the post-secondary environment. Sometimes we don't invest sufficiently in engaging families in actually being part of looking at what it is that we're doing. And because families are often grateful for inclusive post-secondary education, they can actually be lulled into a false sense of complacency. The reality is that because inclusive post-secondary education, even when poorly done, is vastly superior to day programs or sheltered workshops or somebody just sitting at home lonely, not doing anything, that family can really see even poor quality inclusive post-secondary education as a gift. And because inclusive post-secondary education has so much power, even poor quality inclusive post-secondary education can generate better outcomes than day programs or sheltered workshops, etc. So without engaging families actively in learning and examining and understanding practices and policies and why this is done this way and not that way, families are at risk. Um, well, both the Inclusive Post-Secondary Education Initiative is at risk, as well as there's future risk in what happens to that individual's life subsequent to their post-secondary experience. Talking about government funding and policies as a point of vulnerability because we have so little control over those changes, right? And if it's a university governed initiative, the where the funding for the initiative come from or sits within that post-secondary education can be just as vulnerable when the university governance or senior administration changes its priorities, its agenda, its definition of inclusion, which is happening today at some universities. For example, that's another point of vulnerability. However, having said that, families often have more legitimate standing with respect to government, okay, and a voice that can be more likely to be listened to than staff. Typically, staff would be seen as self-serving. It's their income. They're invested in their inclusive post-secondary initiative. So it will be seen, their advocacy can potentially be seen as self-serving. While for a family member, it's their individual's life and future that's literally at stake. So part of safeguarding would be to help families, where you have families engaged, to understand this particularly important role, which means helping them be able to articulate the power and benefit of inclusive post-secondary education, the difference it's making to life now and will make into the future. And when you're advocating, having more people with different experiences and backgrounds talking to government, okay, can be more helpful than just a small number of staff that might be involved in the leadership of inclusive post-secondary initiative, which means in order to have a cadre of family members to be advocates and activists with respect to government and securing quality inclusive post-secondary education over time, you need to be, I believe, maintaining a relationship with those who may be on a waiting list, haven't yet been accepted, for example, those that are currently involved and engaged in inclusive post-secondary learning, and those that have been engaged. That becomes your cohort, if you want, of families that you can attempt then to mobilize in order to take advocacy actions with respect to safeguarding when and where that presents itself. In addition to that, okay, um, you don't want families just acting when things are problematic with government. Families can support an inclusive post-secondary education, help to safeguard it when you've engaged them in speaking to government with respect to the difference inclusive post-secondary education or this initiative is making in their family members' life. In a sense, being grateful and thankful to the ministries that fund these initiatives for what they're achieving and doing, for sharing the outcomes that have been achieved with respect to their family members' participation in inclusive post-secondary education. So it's important not to just mobilize them, if you want, when there's a moment of concern or it's a problem. And in that way, in addition to that, these families are learning to speak up, speak out, to be able to talk to government. And that puts you in a much better position in terms of safeguarding the initiative. In addition, of course, by maintaining relationships with families, at least to the degree possible, for as long as possible, you have a better sense of what outcomes are being achieved over time, and what you may have to redesign or redirect in your initiative when you see perhaps potentially drift with respect to someone's life and their inclusion over time, subsequent to post-secondary education. Lastly, you can think about families in terms of their social networks. Many families can engage, for example, relatives, colleagues, allies, people from their book clubs, etc., which I think are really used to be, anyways, wine drinking clubs. There's less of that at the moment because we know some of the challenges associated now with alcohol to a greater degree. But in enabling families to understand safeguarding, when you're providing opportunities for learning and engaging them in what this is and what this means, you can be encouraging and supporting them to actually be sharing the benefits and values of inclusive post-secondary education with everybody that they're associated with, actually. And in that way, build a stronger alliance for inclusive post-secondary education that when it's just, rather than it just being limited to the families directly themselves and to those providing the inclusive post-secondary education. I want to talk for a moment about when families are in an advocacy and governance, and particularly governance role. And of course, that's not true for every model or construct of the delivery of inclusive post-secondary education. What's critical, and I prefer the term discernment actually, is for an initiative as it gets to know families, whether they're waiting to have their family member accepted or included, or they're currently involved, or their family member is currently involved in inclusive post-secondary education, to be seeking to understand which families, because it's not true for all families, um, are most likely to be candidates for leadership roles. And those are the ones that you want to actually nurture. Those that are the ones that you want to um, bring into leadership roles or advisory roles with respect to the initiative or the organization. And these are just some clues, which we won't have time to go into in detail today, to keep in mind. When a family sees their family member as equally human in all respects, without in fact having been taught that, it's innate, it's part of their nature. They've never seen their family member in any other way other than being equally, fully, totally, completely human with the same desire to belong, to learn, to contribute, to be respected as anyone else. Those families are more likely to be good candidates for leadership roles and in safeguarding. And when they want the very best life has to offer, when they're not willing to settle for second best. Okay. Now, families ordinarily, when they have a family member without a disability, that's the way they operate. They want the very best life has to offer. When families have a family member with a disability, they can be, um, can't think of a good word, submit, if you want, to second best offers because of the struggles and the challenges, and not be continually advocating or agonizing over the fact that their family member doesn't yet have the best of what life has to offer. Those families that hold this view of of wanting the very best, of not being content with the way things are, of being able to see what things should be, what life should look like, what initiatives should be offering, they have the greatest potential to be um, in advocacy and governance roles. And of course, because you're typically dealing with families who have adult family members, you can look to their past coherent advocacy efforts. Often, busy people are the ones that are the people that are best in terms of being advocates and contributing to governance. And sometimes those are the ones we're least likely to ask because we see them as being busy. Being busy in the right way, such in terms of past coherent advocacy, can be a sign that we want to bring this family in and nurture and foster their leadership capacities and abilities. And that means actively nurturing them, not just assuming it's going to be there. Just as one might be actively assisting them in understanding what inclusion can look like outside of inclusive post-secondary education and beyond inclusive post-secondary education, you can actively nurture their leadership abilities and capacities and have them in a better position actually to therefore safeguard the initiative as a consequence. You want them to be critical thinkers. In fact, although that's not part of the presentation today, one of the most effective safeguard strategies is to have critical friends. I may have this somewhere in the PowerPoint, I can't remember now, sorry, is where you invite people with the same values and the same commitment to inclusion to come in, right, and take a critical look at what you're doing as an inclusive post-secondary initiative and seeking their input and expecting them actually not to just praise what you're doing, but to point out where there could be improvements that's difficult for any of us to see, no matter how competent we are, when we're immersed directly in the providing the initiative ourselves. Somebody coming from outside with the same values can offer a perspective that just by virtue of being human, we can't see when we're deeply embedded in the initiative ourselves. So going
Bruce,
back, yep, sorry.
we've got
Yep.
about 20 minutes left.
Okay, so I'll move faster. Okay. So particularly important is to help families learn to tell, to be effective storytellers. Okay. The story of me, us, and now is from Marshall Gantz. Actually, you can look him up. We won't have time to go after that, but it's a particularly important as human beings. That's how we describe our lives is through stories. You want families to be able to use storytelling in a way that sustains and advances the inclusive post-secondary initiatives. Okay. So just a few more comments with respect to families and advocacy and government's role. Okay. It lies in their being able to exercise their voice that's rooted in passion, hopes, fears, and anger. Okay. You want that to be, you want to tap into that with respect to families who are going to be engaged in safeguarding inclusive post-secondary initiative, which means they need to understand why this inclusive post-secondary education practice and not others. Okay. I know initiatives where they have a nonprofit board of family members and they are completely subject to the senior staff leader. Questioning is not part of their values or their ethos as an organization. And consequently, practice doesn't improve over time. They need to know what constitutes quality, inclusive post-secondary education. And I've mentioned already the idea of being critical friends. For those of you that are in organizations that operate, nonprofit organizations operate inclusive post-secondary education as initiatives, as I mentioned earlier, the succession to the next CEO or executive director is a very critical point of vulnerabilities. I've mentioned before, families can't be the only safeguard. And that transition is a huge moment of vulnerability when you move, particularly from long-term senior leadership, people that may have had, sort of founding roles in the organization, et cetera. And so when you have a nonprofit board of families and you want them to be engaged in safeguarding, okay, this needs to be part of what you're investing in families' learning and development, particularly when you get close to a moment where there's going to be a succession in leadership. Now, with respect to, I'll do programmatic drift quickly, okay? I said at the very beginning, it's inevitable, okay? It's just the nature of the universe, okay? Things will drift off course. For those providing initiative and for families, the most critical aspect of safeguarding is to be able to discern or detect or see that drift at its earliest moment in time. Because the longer the drift goes on, the more entrenched the deviation is from the best values-based practice or quality that should have been in place all along the way. So this is something to educate families in and have them play a role as critical thinkers in your organizational efforts to help you detect when there's drift. There can be drift in terms of initiatives that find it easier to admit some students and not others. They limit what post inclusive employment or life can look like after completing studies or graduating, for example. Maybe they're not continuing to expand into areas of the university or college or technical institute where inclusion could be offered given the interests of the students that are applying to go to college or university, et cetera. Just a few examples. I'm not going to spend much time on this in the interest of time, but essentially, with respect to post-secondary institutions, families often have less, as opposed to government, less authority, if you want. Post-secondary institutions, at least historically, have really looked to students to be able to question practices in the universities, they can speak for themselves, they can organize themselves, etc. And they typically aren't very enthralled when parents approach the post-secondary education with respect to those practices. In our situations, our students aren't often in the same position to easily question the practice. More so, they're able to do that if they have solid relationships with students without disabilities, with peers without disabilities. So this is an area in which families often actually have less position to do well with respect to safeguarding. I want to say something quickly about those of you who may be part of an initiative that's operated by the college or the university or the technical school. There is actually greater degree of vulnerability to drift because there's really not a lot of control over what the university or institution is going to do in the future. Okay? They make all kinds of decisions based on other interests of the university or the college with respect to changes in funding, changes in their thinking about what they are as an institution, their priorities, etc., where they're going to situate the post-secondary initiative and so forth. So to balance that off to some degree, it helps to be able to think about, if one isn't in place, an advisory committee, not just of families, but potentially of others from the post-secondary institution and others in the community who can be in a role whereby they can speak to the institution about what needs to be safeguarded over time when changes are taking place, in the governance or administrative levels of the post-secondary institution itself. So to sort of get closer to the end, it's helpful to think about actively what you can be doing to strengthen family advocacy and resiliency. Within the time period you have families engaged with your inclusive post-secondary initiative, how you're supporting families to pursue and sustain inclusion and relationship beyond post-secondary. And ideally, families know they can come back to you for support and advice. And in that way, you actually will continue to have them as likely advocates and supporters when you need them into the future, which means following up with families. We won't do that one. We'll stop there. So we can